their subject matter for that reason. We actually have a hearing at MAPC and a hearing that happens here in our presence, and we're supposed to come to that without bias. And so, to me, that's how I've handled that personally. One of the challenges, again, there's a couple ways. You said the lowest was $20 on that reporting.
That's the lowest I've seen.
So let me ask a question. Let's say a commissioner, right now we don't have a monetary threshold. Okay. We don't right now. Actually, we do. It's $500. But if someone was to receive a gift over $500, they're supposed to fill out a substantial interest form. And I've looked. I don't think any elected official in the history of our entire state has ever filled out a conflict of interest form for any gift over $500, ever. I don't think it's ever happened by anybody. We fill out the form when you run for office for boards you sit on and financial interest, things like that. But in terms of receiving a gift, has never triggered, if you will, a filing of a substantial interest form. Having said that, it's my personal opinion that when you are offered a gift, regardless of the amount, one way to look at this, and I would love to have my colleagues talk about this or weigh in on this as well. I think you have three options as an elected official. Either don't receive the gift, or receive the gift and pay the county the value of that gift, because essentially it's a gift to the county, county taxpayers, if you will, pay the county for the value of that gift, or to report it. And one of the things we're missing here is we don't actually have a logistical way to report meals or gifts of any value other than the substantial interest form. Right. And I think that's hugely lacking. If we're going to have a meaningful ethics policy, we need to have a way to report things. And if we want to set a threshold, that's fine. But I would tell you, if you want to receive a meal for a $25 meal, I have no problem reporting a $25 meal. Or pay for it yourself, or pay the county $25 for the value of that meal. To me, those are three options. To me, that would be better than setting a threshold, personally. So if you receive anything of value, then you have three options. But what we're missing right now is we don't have any way to report, items less than $500. There's no way to do that. So I think that we're missing something significantly there.
So that kind of goes back to the suggested best practices, where you have the written policy, you have the annual disclosures, what have you. So it sounds like you're kind of touching on that part of the presentation.
Well, this is just me personally. I have no idea what anybody else here thinks, but that's what I would like to see us do. I think that's the right direction for us to go. I'm serious about the ethics advisor. I think we need to identify someone in our staff that can serve as an ethics advisor. We should be able to document questions and answers to them. And then, of course, since we're all elected officials, we all receive campaign donations at some point. And there's that pay-for-play idea. What is, in your opinion, how do you resolve the fact that you may receive campaign donations from someone in the community, maybe it's a business or individual, some point in the future, didn't know you were going to do it, but some point in the future, some subject matter comes up where you have in the past received a donation from somebody. How do you deal with that? Is there some time period that you look at, or how do you resolve that?
One of the first things that I personally take a look at is, what's the magnitude of the donation? If we're talking a $50 donation versus a $10,000 donation, those are two different things to me. So that's the first thing I look at. I think the time element could come into play. If you ran for office 3-4 years ago, and you have not received donations or don't have social interactions with that individual outside of that, then that's a different situation than if this person is also, you're frequently socializing with them, what have you. So again, I think a lot of this, it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, given the actual factors that are at play. It's very hard to just say blanketly, this is good, this is bad, without having specifics.
Well, I'm struggling with your answer, because I think this is much more complex than that, in my opinion. First of all, any one entity is allowed to only donate up to $500, so there's a limit. But some people have multiple businesses, or a married couple can do $1,000 and that type of thing. But the reality is, sometimes some people in the community give to lots and lots and lots of candidates, and they have lots of business interests around town. Sometimes there's money given to boards that people serve on. There's all kinds of things that could go on, and it's really kind of hard to dissect it all. And to me, the time factor, if there's going to be a time factor, to me, it should be defined what that would be. But right now, there seems to be no definition as to when someone would be allowed. Right now, it's just set up. You can do, for each campaign cycle, you're allowed to do up to the limit per entity. So
Commissioner Howe, I think she within her recommendations, she's mentioned to create a policy if we were to set limits or go above and beyond what the State of Kansas Ethics Commission requires of us. Is that what I'm hearing you
Yes.
say? Okay. So if that would be a discussion that, I mean, we can talk about it all day long if you want, but I mean, I think that's kind of what she's saying.
That's exactly right. I mean, a lot of local governments that I work with in Kansas, they have a specific conflict of interest policy that has, thresholds or whatever they have determined internally that their requirements are going to be, has annual disclosure, annual acknowledgement. And they are much more stringent than what KSA 75 has.
And we could
included.
create that, I mean, as a board here. And if you'd like to do that, maybe we could get with Mike Papoon and have something drafted.
Well, just for your information, I have been working on an ethics policy that I would like to propose at some point, but basically it's kind of a compromise between the Wyandotte County policy and the Johnson County policy. I think they both have merit. There's things about them both I like, and there's things about them both I think are lacking. But I think there's elements of both of those policies I would like to springboard off of, and I think we can even make it better than that. But I do think we have a need for a more robust ethics policy. And how that deals with campaign finance. Our state does, issue campaign finance laws, and maybe that's sufficient for that one part of this whole thing. But there's a lot more to conflicts of interest and ethics. Some of the things you mentioned today are not just that. They're not just conflicts of interest, but they're actually unethical or corruption or crimes. There's things in here that are clearly not unacceptable in some of those scenarios you read earlier. Campaign finance is right now defined by the state primarily. So maybe that's good enough. I just don't know. Thank you.
Commissioner Dennis, did you have a question? You flipped your light on. I don't know if you had something to say.
Thank you. I wanted to address one thing that Commissioner Howell brought up about citizens advisory boards. They are strictly advisory boards. If you look at a recent case that we just had come before us, we were looking at a zoning case out here by Central and 167th. My advisory board voted 8-1 to deny that, and they're not experts on zoning. It was an advisory, and we voted 5-0 to pass it. So you use them as an advisory board. I don't run my advisory board. Someone else does. So I think they have their place, and I certainly think that they ought to be taking a look at all the different aspects of government and not limiting them. So that was just my comment. Thank you.
So, Lindsay, if I may ask a question, I was kind of under the impression that outside of what you've presented as sort of the precursor of conflict of interest, we were going to talk about specifically ARPA funds. Are you guys going to get to that, or
No?
So
because I was under the impression we were going to, because you kind of sent out an email telling us we couldn't talk about it to anyone, and so I'd like for that to be addressed, and how serving on boards when we don't have a financial interest in any way, shape, or form on any of these, how that plays into ARPA funds specifically and our communication about them to the community. Can you address that?
I sure can, and then I'll see if Shauna has any thoughts she wants to add on. So the reason we scheduled this training is because we do know that under the uniform guidance, which is the, that kind of full federal rule book that we've talked about, that applies under ARPA. The whole thing did not apply under CARES.
Would you mind speaking into that microphone?
Yes, I'm sorry. Is that
Thank
better?
you.
I
Sure.
apologize. I thought I was loud enough. We would need to make sure that for all things going forward, for all things procurement, that we resolve any conflicts of interest, not just identify, but resolve. And so that was one of the really critical parts of what we heard here today. We need to be able to understand that because the federal rules require, while our own rules require it, federal rules especially require fairness and equity. And so, Shauna, I think you and I had talked at one point a little bit about, if a commissioner does sit on a board, or for example, senior staff, which is why there's a lot of people in the room, because there are people here who have the opportunity to influence outcomes. I, for example, sit on a few boards. If I'm sitting on a board And there's going to be opportunities for that board to potentially come and get funding as a subrecipient or as maybe a vendor. What would be the appropriate steps for me to take if I sit on that board and I know that that entity could come before the county?
In my opinion, you would be recusing yourself. You would disclose what your potential conflict was. You would recuse yourself. You wouldn't vote. You wouldn't discuss. You wouldn't make public pronouncements. You wouldn't be in the room. So it would be handled by others outside of you, so that there would be no, hopefully, possibility that anybody could say, well, that entity got money because of the relationship they have with Lindsay Poe or so. If anyone brought that question up, the answer would be, obviously, clearly they did not, because Lindsay was not present, Lindsay did not speak, Lindsay did not involve herself, she did not vote.
So involved in what room? So can you just give us a real example?
So if the discussion were going on in this room, and one of you all had a potential conflict with regard, you sat on a committee that was up for being funded under ARPA. Best practices would be that the individual, the one of you that had that relationship, would leave the room, so that you were not here to even hear the discussion. And given, like the example I gave earlier in my history, where I had a gentleman who had recused himself and didn't participate in the vote of the discussion, but he sat in the corner of the room and made facial expressions and noises that clearly let everybody else know what he thought. And in that particular situation, that man had the personal influence that it was strongly possible that he was able to influence the decision made in the room by his physical presence and what he was doing. So to avoid that potential outcome, our best practices recommendation is that not only you recuse yourself and not vote or not participate in the discussion, that you not even be in the room when it's being had.
What about, so for example, with WAMPO, there's 4 of us on that board. How is this going to be fair if we can vote on that, but we can't vote on these other boards that we've been placed on to help these organizations?
That is something I do not have an answer for you off the top of my head. That's something I would have to look into and know a lot more about.
Okay, thank you.
So if during this time, let's say we hypothetically recused ourselves from the board we sit on, would that be a conflict of interest? If we have recused ourselves and we've taken a leave of absence from the specific boards within the community?
If there's a possibility that you're going to go back, so if it's a leave of absence, I'm not sure that would actually have the total effect you're wanting. If you just resigned your position on the board and were no longer a member of that board, that's a different story. That's like divestment, which is another option as well. So that could be a potential resolution. It would be up to you whether or not it was one that you wanted to make.
So what about just discussion? Because your email kind of made it sound like we couldn't even talk to anybody about it.
So, and let me speak to that real quick so you can have some of the background. So that is related to a specific vendor. So and this is training that BKD has provided some for us as staff. And that is that when there is a specific vendor that we might be dealing with, it's inappropriate for us to interact with that particular vendor and not others, because we have to give the same treatment to all vendors. And so what I was saying in that email was on the vendors, because you'll note it doesn't talk about subrecipients. It just talks about people who might do business. So for example, what prompted that email was the fact that that week the commission had voted to approve the remodel of this building. We knew that several folks in the community who had interest in potentially performing that work were reaching out at least to staff, and we thought it was likely that they potentially could reach out to you all too. And so what we didn't want was for you to interact with those folks and give them information on the process, what the thought process was, and accidentally give them an edge over what other construction vendors might have, because by virtue of that having that conversation, we've been told they're not going to be able to be a part of the process in the long term because they've been given that special consideration. And so, Shauna, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
So in this particular situation that you described, very often what we recommend is that you designate someone within the county's purchasing department to be the point of contact for that particular project. So then anyone who wants to talk about that project, ask questions, gets information, is contacting one person who knows what everyone asked and what everyone was told. A lot of times, what we will recommend is, you take whatever the questions are, and then periodically you basically publish publicly frequently asked questions and their answers, so that everyone has available to the same information at the same time.
So if I'm at an event, and someone comes up to me and they say, how do I apply for X? I just can't say I can't talk to you about it, or
No.
I give them the appropriate person to talk to about it.
You can give them the appropriate person to talk to about it. That's not a problem at all. But it would be that person's responsibility to do any of the back and forth discussion about the specifics of the opportunity.
So I think, Commissioner, to get to your point, because it's something that I struggle with too on at least two of the boards that I sit on, and that is access to information about process. And so I guess I'm going to pose a question to you that I didn't warn you about, so
Okay.
you can yell at me later. If we are going through this process now, where commissioners are collecting data, right? We're learning what needs are in the community as a part of our best practice for allocating the federal funds. So we're in this weird place where we have potential folks who want money, probably subrecipients, or a beneficiary, people who are getting money to operate their own service. They're not doing it on our behalf. What type of information can we talk to them with regard to the process itself? What information can we share about when things will be ready? That kind of.
So are you talking about you're in the process of doing your community needs assessment? Okay. Best practice there would be that the actual individual public officials not be involved in that you have a group of people below that level who are doing that. And in that particular instance, you are primarily acting as a sounding board. You're listening. You are getting information. You're not necessarily sharing a lot of information, other than you certainly can share information about, when it comes time to apply, we will have an online portal and it will be announced on the county's website. That is absolutely appropriate. Or to say, Joe Thomas has been designated as the individual within purchasing and procurement who's going to be the point person for this. And in the future, once we are ready, once the timeline for this process has begun, you are welcome to interact with Joe, contact Joe for information, what have you. So you can get information from them. It's just not necessarily a two-way street.
Okay, for me, I think that helps with the boards I sit on. I don't know, is that getting toward, Commissioner Howell, you mentioned some boards. Is that?
I have a question about, so when we had the CARES discussion and we allocated all of that, all those millions of dollars through the team that sat right in this room, that was like a buffer to us. I sat on a couple of boards that received money from CARES. The recommendation was made to us. I didn't make that there wasn't any. So is there a way to create that buffer? Because I'm really having trouble. I want to follow the rules, but people come to me all the time with questions. And so part of my job is answering questions and sending people to the right place. So what I just heard you say, and please repeat it if I'm wrong, but so if somebody comes to me and asks me a question, can I listen to them to send them to the right person?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Again, you're kind of more of like a sounding board. And ideally, you're not setting yourself up like holding forums, come talk to, your county commissioner about this. But if you're at an event and someone, comes up to you and asks a question, yes, and depending upon what that question is, if it's a lot of specifics about, this is a program I want to stand up, will this be eligible? That is a question you do not answer. That is a question that would, have to be referred to the appropriate person in the ARPA group. That's different than if it's a question from somebody who says, under the CARES Act, you all had an online application process, and we had X amount of time to fill out the application, and there was somebody to help us, et cetera. Is that going to happen again? Then you're, to your knowledge, if you know the county is going to be setting up an application process, you can say, to the best of my knowledge at the moment, there will be an application process, and it will be made public when that's available. more information to come. And that's really kind of the extent. You don't want to be the individuals giving a lot of very detailed information. You want someone else, because again, you do want that buffer. I mean, that's why in my example, I'm pointing at Joe. Joe would be, a buffer so that the information going between any subrecipients or beneficiaries in the county would not be happening at your level, so that there would be a cleaner demarcation for when you were making decisions and approving applications or platforms or spending platforms, what have you.
Well, unless you've sent some information to them that you haven't sent to me, I don't really have a lot of information to give. I mean, we haven't really been given a lot of information. I mean, that's,
Right.
we have like a little set of guidance, but we haven't been given a lot of information.
I think it's the issue where I have seen is we are starting to get reached out to about those broader categories of eligibility. So broadband would be an example, or the construction of this building, or some of those things where there are some very specific ideas and things that are floating out there with specific vendors who would be used. So not necessarily like the folks that you sit on the boards with. It's more about people who we will be paying to do something on our behalf. And that's where we want to close it off and send it. And so we've got that bidder registration link, so that if they are going to be in that business, they can come and register. And then as soon as that's ready, purchasing sends out a notification that this is ready. And that way, everybody gets treated the same. Everybody gets the same information. That's really more the focus. I think in terms of, I'll just give a real life example. I sit on Starkey's board. So one of the things I have to be careful to do is to not make sure I'm telling Starkey, this is the date it's going to be available. These are the types of programs we're going to operate. I think you guys would be eligible. That's where I have to stop and make sure that I'm not having any kind of communication on that or in anything, in any of the discussions we're having in our team.
Okay, so when is the appropriate time to say when applications are up? I mean, is there a threshold that the county posts it and then we can share it? Like, what is, because that's part of our job, is to let people know what the heck's going on and how to do things. I mean, I want to make sure that, I have a different reach than the county does, than Sarah. I mean, we all have a different reach, and I think that makes us stronger in being able to communicate these kinds of things to the community, because that's really what we're here to do, is to get this money where it needs to go. So what, in your opinion, what's the most appropriate way to do that, like on our social media channels?
I think once the county has made a finalized decision of what that timeline is going to be, even if it's before the timeline, but once the final decision has been made, then you all would be free to publicize that information with regard to the portal's going to be open on this date, applications will be accepted through XYZ, whatever that type of information is.
Okay.
Surely anything that's been discussed publicly is welcome to be shared, right?
Yes.
On social media or anything like that.
Right.
Okay.
Any questions from the audience? Lonnie Wright, you don't have any questions?
I have a lot of questions.
Well, ask them.
I don't know that this really clears things up for the people making decisions. And we're talking, it's kind of a different standard than what the city developed, if you're working towards an ethics policy. I think we're identifying everything is so situational. It's hard to have a clear understanding of what a conflict is and isn't. And regardless of what the words say, if the media says it's a conflict, you can't say the words say it's okay. They link it up. So it seems like you can only do your best and be responsible, but it's a risk.
Well, and hopefully we can disclose whatever we need to disclose to not have those conflicts. You got a question?
Well,
Commissioner Howell?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Cruz. I'm thinking about budget right now. I mean, just for example, and by the way, I'm also an advocate for TK, the African American Museum. But there's a discussion about finding $450,000 in the budget to provide some support to them for their relocation. The commissioner that brought that up, and again, I agree with the comments that she made, but she sits on their board, for example.
But that's not ARPA funds. That's,
No, it's not ARPA funds. I'm just talking about the conflict of interest discussion that we had earlier. It's not about ARPA funds for me. The ARPA funds is easy because I don't know anything, like you said. I just simply refer to people to Brent Chilton. I'm sure you're getting phone calls from me, sending people your way every day, practically. To me, that's the easy answer. I say, yeah, there's ARPA funds. I don't know how to do it, but Brent does. Talk to Brent. And but for us, the issue, the term conflict of interest, that's a great example. I love the African American Museum. I want them to be successful. I want them to get the funding that they need. But the ask right now is for $450,000, and it was raised essentially by the board member, the commissioner that sits on their board. And I sit on all kinds of boards. We all do. We advocate for those board positions, and we also advocate for our districts. You might say, well, you're advocating for your district for a thing that's going to benefit your district. Well, yeah, of course. That's my job. I'm the people's representative, but I'm going to advocate for things I believe in this community. In fact, one of your scenarios talks about, we have the sole discretion to make a decision. Nobody here has a sole discretion to make any decision. Everything we do here is a board decision. So to me, disclosing that relationship or disclosing I have a friend or I don't know if you know this about me. My sister-in-law was the election commissioner for 10 years. She just left office, but some people view that as a conflict of interest. We vote on budget that deals with her office. And she'll tell you that we didn't really agree on a lot of things necessarily. I went to bat trying to find ways to find efficiencies in the office, and I'm sure she appreciated all that. Nevertheless, people might assume I'm soft on her because she's a relative. Mm-hmm. Bear in mind, she was election commissioner before I was a commissioner. So what do? I hate to recuse myself because my job is essentially to advocate for the county, and I was doing that. Somebody might view that as a conflict of interest. And I think there's lots of examples of this. Even if it wasn't a family member, we all have close friends. I know 1,000 people, I'm sure, that I could say, I could look at any department in Sedgwick County, and I could tell you, I probably have several friends who work in that department. We all have friends. So where does it, when do you stop advocating for things you believe in? Because somebody might say, well, you're a friend with so-and-so. In fact, the last property rights case we did, I was friends with people on both sides of the issue. I still had to make a vote. And if had I not voted, we wouldn't have had 4 votes either way. And I'm not sure what happens to a property rights case if you don't have 4 votes in that particular case. You have to have 4 votes. Part of me said, I have friends on both sides of the issue, but they didn't influence me as a friendship. And some of them are upset with me about that. It's just the reality. But the reality is we have responsibility to sort out policy and to advocate for our district and advocate for things we believe in. And we're a board. We're not executives to make any decisions. So does that change any of this in any way to you?
To me, from a best practices standpoint, no. I understand what you're saying, and that's why throughout my presentation I kept saying public officials have friends. It's known. We expect that. But, I think when you just make your disclosure, that disclosure needs to be more than just, I'm a friend of Joe Smith, and he is an XYZ at this company. It needs to be, I am a close friend of Joe Smith, and this is how how you personally generally define close friend, versus I am acquainted with Joe Smith, and in the past 12 months, we have gone to lunch twice. You need to give other people, in their transparency discussion, you need to give a sense so that they can, have a sense of where you stand on that and whether or not it may be influencing your opinion. In that disclosure, you are also absolutely, it would be appropriate for you to say, and I don't believe that this impacts my impartiality because. So it's not just that you're disclosing and saying I have these issues. You are also welcome to say, not an issue for me, and this is why.
Well, thank you for that answer. Again, I think things are sometimes difficult because, again, I might judge my own opinion. I'm not close contact, or I'm not a close friend, whatever, and it's not influencing me. But somebody else will always make the accusation regardless. So that apparent conflict of interest is out there. And again, if you know a lot of people, you're involved in a lot of boards, and we spend a lot of money, I think there's always opportunities for someone to be accused, I guess, of doing things for the wrong reasons. But
But the best you can do is lay what, your set of facts are. You're right. Some people will always take the counter position, and you can't change everybody's mind. All you can do is be as transparent as you possibly can about your situation and how you arrived at your decisions.
And just since we're talking about this, I already mentioned the election commissioner preceded me to her position before I came here. That's true. My daughter-in-law, who works for EMS, was a paramedic before she ever married into my family. I get accused of being passionate about EMS because of her. She has nothing to do with it, honestly. But the issue itself drove me to all the decisions and discussion that we've had over the last several months. But I get accused of doing things for the wrong reason because of a family member who happens to be my daughter-in-law, who was a paramedic before she married into my family.
I think, though, that's the perception.
Right.
That's what she talked about. I mean, even if there isn't a conflict of interest in your mind, there is a perception that there could be one.
Well,
And that's where it comes
again,
in.
so I can state the facts and data all around that and say that it's not about her in any way. It's about the data. The data matters. And the things that we discussed, I think, were pretty fact-based. And they stand on their own. It's not about any one person out there that caused any of that to happen. It's just the data is what drove us to make decisions here on this bench. But at the end of the day, I have had family members in numerous departments around the county. I would argue that they have a right to employment, and I have to do my very best to make policy the best I can without any undue influence considering them in any way. And I think I'm doing that, but the reality is that accusation will always be out there. Thank you.
Anything else? I hear you drove all the way down from Kansas City to give us this presentation
I
today.
did.
Appreciate your time. Coming, you drove through the Flint Hills.
Oh, beautiful. They're
Oh
absolutely
my
beautiful.
gosh, my daughter and I just drove through them this past weekend, and they were gorgeous. Good time of year. All right, anybody else have any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for being here today.